Lysandra was a creature of shattered pieces, held together by silence and shame. In the brutal hierarchy of the obsidian claw pack, she was less than nothing. She was an omega, a wolfless omega, a barren stain on a family name that had already been dragged through the mud decades ago. Her parents were gone, lost to a border skirmish that her uncle, the current Alpha Theron, called a necessary sacrifice. Lysandra called it a convenient tragedy. It had left him in power, and her in his shadow. The pack valued strength above all else, brawling prowess, the ferocity of one's inner wolf, the ability to bear strong pups. These were the currencies of worth. Lysandra possessed none of them. Her wolf had never manifested, leaving a hollow ache where a second soul should have been. The pack healers had declared her barren at 16, a final, damning verdict. She was a splinter in the pack's hide, a constant, irritating reminder of weakness. Her only solace was movement. In the secluded grove behind the pack house, where the weeping willows veiled the moonlight, she would dance. It was a secret, shameful thing, this twisting and turning of her lithe body to rhythms only she could hear. Dancing was useless. It could not hunt, could not fight, could not secure a bloodline. It was a frivolous, delicate art in a world of stone and claw. Yet, in that secret space, she was not the shattered omega. She was whole. Her limbs told stories her voice could not, tales of sorrow and a desperate, flickering hope. The news arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day. The Alpha King was coming. Not just any Alpha, but King Zephyros of the Shadowlands, a monarch whose name was a whispered curse in the territories. He was a conqueror, a beast of a man whose armies had swallowed smaller packs whole. The Obsidian Claw had bent the knee years ago, sending tribute annually to keep his wrath at bay. This year, for the first time, he was coming to collect it himself. Fear, thick and cloying, settled over the pack. Theron called a gathering in the great hall, his face a mask of strained authority. He stood before the hearth, firelight glinting off the silver in his dark hair. "King Zephyros honors us with his presence," he announced, his voice booming with false confidence. "He demands our finest tribute, a symbol of our unwavering loyalty." A murmur rippled through the assembled wolves. The finest hunters? The best of the harvest? Gold from their meager mines? Theron's eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the crowd. They passed over strong warriors and fertile she-wolves, over skilled artisans and wise elders. Then, they landed on Lysandra, standing near the back, trying to make herself invisible. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "We will offer him something unique," Theron declared, his voice dripping with malice that only Lysandra could fully recognize. "A display of our culture. My niece, Lysandra, will dance for him." A collective gasp, followed by a wave of snickering laughter, filled the hall. It was the ultimate insult, both to her and to the king, to offer a wolfless, barren omega as entertainment was a mockery. They were presenting their most useless member as a symbol of their pack. It was Theron's way of punishing her for existing, of using her brokenness as a political statement. Lysandra's blood ran cold. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, a physical weight of scorn and pity. He wanted to humiliate her, to break the last unbroken piece of her spirit on the stone floor of the great hall, all for the viewing pleasure of a monster king. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. There was no refusing an Alpha's command. She was being led to slaughter, not by claw or fang, but by shame. The night of the king's arrival felt like the end of the world. A chilling wind swept down from the mountains that bordered the Shadowlands, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something wild and dangerous. King Zephyros arrived not with an army, but with only a handful of his royal guard, their black armor seeming to drink the torchlight. It was a testament to his power that he needed no more. He was larger than she had imagined, a giant carved from granite and shadow. His hair was as black as a starless night, and his eyes, when they swept the hall, were a piercing glacial gray. A jagged scar ran from his temple down his cheek, a white line against his stern, unforgiving face. Power rolled off him in palpable waves, a suffocating pressure that made every wolf in the room, including Alpha Theron, lower their gaze. He did not sit on the throne Theron offered, but remained standing, a predator surveying his territory. "You have my tribute?" King Zephyrus's voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together in the deep earth. It was a voice that expected and received absolute obedience. Theron plastered on a servile smile. "Of course, Your Majesty. We offer you a performance, a dance from the most unique of our pack." He gestured sharply toward Lysandra, who was being pushed forward by two of his guards. She stumbled into the center of the hall, her simple linen dress feeling as thin as cobwebs. The stone floor was cold beneath her bare feet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. She could feel the contempt of her packmates and the cold, analytical gaze of the Shadow King. This was it, the moment of her final public destruction. The great hall of the Obsidian Claw was a theater of cruelty, and Lysandra was the unwilling star. Every torch seemed to conspire to illuminate her, to expose her trembling form to the sea of hostile faces. Her uncle Theron's smirk was a venomous slash in the firelight. He had orchestrated this perfectly, a masterpiece of humiliation, designed to break her spirit completely while feigning respect for his overlord. To present this a flawed, wolfless Omega was to offer trash and call it treasure. A musician in the corner, on Theron's sharp command, began to play a slow, mournful tune on a simple flute. It was a dirge, a song of sorrow. They were not even granting her the dignity of a proper melody. They were playing the soundtrack to her shame. For a heartbeat, Lysandra's limbs refused to move. Fear was a block of ice in her veins. She could run. She could scream. She could fall to her knees and beg for mercy. But then she looked up, past the jeering faces of her pack, and met the eyes of the Alpha King. His gaze was not mocking. It was unnervingly still, a winter storm held in perfect, terrifying suspension. There was no pity in it, but there was no scorn either. There was only an intense, unnerving focus. Something shifted inside her. A tiny, defiant ember flared in the hollow of her chest. If they wanted a performance, she would give them one. If they wanted to see her break, she would show them the beauty in what was broken. She would not dance their dirge of shame. She would dance her own story. Lysandra closed her eyes, shutting out the hall, the king, her tormentors. She let the clumsy flute melody fade away and found the rhythm that lived within her blood, the silent music of her own resilient heart. She took a breath, and then she began to move. Her first steps were hesitant, the language of a fawn testing a frozen lake. Then, as the inner music swelled, her movements grew bolder. She did not perform the stomping, aggressive dances of pack warriors. Her dance was one of fluid grace, of lines and curves that spoke of willow branches in the wind and water flowing over stone. Her arms rose, carving arcs through the air, her hands telling a story of reaching for a sky she could never touch. She spun, her simple dress flaring around her, and in that spin, she poured all her years of silent suffering, the loneliness of her childhood, the sting of being called defective, the quiet agony of being an outcast in her own home. It was all there, but mingled with the sorrow was a thread of pure, unyielding defiance. Her back arched, a gesture not of submission, but of strength. Her feet moved across the stone, not with the weight of despair, but with the lightness of a spirit that refused to be crushed. The snickering in the hall died away, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. The wolves of the Obsidian Claw had only ever seen her as a clumsy, withdrawn girl. They had never seen this creature of raw, aching beauty. They did not understand what they were seeing, but they could not look away. From Zephyros's perspective, the world had narrowed to the girl in the center of the room. When she had been pushed forward, a frail thing in a threadbare dress, he had felt a familiar surge of irritation. Theron was a fool, playing a dangerous game. Did he think Zephyros, the king who had toppled mountains and silenced armies, would be amused by this pathetic offering? He was about to voice his displeasure, to perhaps make an example of Theron for the insult, when she had begun to move, and everything stopped. For years, Zephyros had lived with a constant storm inside him, a gnawing, tearing beast of shadow and rage that was his curse, his secret shame. It was a ceaseless cacophony of pain and fury that left him isolated, untouchable, perpetually on the edge of losing control. He had built walls of ice and iron around his soul to contain it. But the girl, her dance was like a single, perfect note of music that cut through the hurricane. As she moved, a strange, unprecedented quiet fell over the beast within him. The tearing claws seemed to loosen their grip. The roaring faded to a distant hum. He watched the lines of her body, the sorrow and strength in her expression, and for the first time in a decade, he could breathe without feeling the serrated edge of his own inner darkness. He saw not a weak Omega, but a survivor. He saw a grace that was a form of power he had never encountered before. It was not the power of fang and claw, but it was power nonetheless. When her dance ended, she stood with her chest rising and falling, her head bowed, awaiting the inevitable judgment. The silence in the hall was absolute, heavy with confusion and a strange new tension. King Zephyros took a step forward, the sound of his boots on the stone echoing like a death knell. He ignored Theron, who was now looking pale and uncertain. He walked until he stood directly before Lysandra. She forced herself to look up at him, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. This was it. He would strike her down for the mockery, or dismiss her with a contemptuous word. His glacial gray eyes held hers. The storm was still there, deep within them, but now she could see something else, a flicker of something. Not kindness, not yet, but a raw, consuming curiosity. "You," he said, his voice a low command that vibrated through her bones. "You are the tribute." It was not a question. It was a declaration. Theron's jaw dropped. "Your Majesty, she is nothing." A faulty Omega, wolfless, useless. Zephyros's head snapped toward him, and a low growl, more animal than man, silenced Theron instantly. The sheer murderous intent in that sound made every wolf in the hall flinch. "I have made my choice," Zephyros stated, his eyes never leaving Lysandra. "She will return with me to the Shadowlands." The shock in the room was a physical force. He was not just accepting the tribute. He was claiming her. He was taking their broken toy and declaring it his prize. Lysandra could only stare, breathless, as the feared Alpha King, the monster from the legends, sealed her fate with 4 simple words, dragging her from one cage only to throw her into another, far more terrifying one. The journey to the Shadowlands was a silent, grim affair. Lysandra was placed on a horse and surrounded by the king's royal guard, their black armor a stark contrast to the snow-dusted pines they passed. The king himself rode at the head of the procession, his back a rigid wall of muscle and authority. He never once looked back at her. She was a possession, a piece of tribute being transported, nothing more. The Shadowlands lived up to their name. The mountains grew taller, their peaks like jagged teeth tearing at a bruised sky. The trees were ancient and gnarled, and a perpetual twilight seemed to cling to the valleys. Zephyros's fortress was not a castle of elegant spires, but a brutalist citadel of dark, volcanic rock that seemed to have been clawed from the mountain itself. It was a place built to withstand sieges, both from without and, she would soon learn, from within. Inside, the fortress was just as intimidating. The halls were vast and cold, echoing with the footfalls of guards. Tapestries depicting legendary battles and monstrous beasts hung on the stone walls, their threads dark with age. The staff who met her were disciplined and silent, their faces impassive. They showed her to a suite of rooms larger and more luxurious than any she had ever known, with a hearth that burned brightly, and furs piled high on the bed. But the heavy oak door and the barred windows made its true nature clear. It was a gilded cage. For 2 days, she was left alone. Food was brought on silver trays, and a servant girl laid out clean clothes, but no one spoke to her beyond quiet, respectful necessities. She was a ghost haunting these opulent rooms, her purpose a terrifying mystery. She expected cruelty, violence, or at the very least, cold neglect. This respectful confinement was somehow more unnerving. On the evening of the 3rd day, the summons came. A guard, his face a mask of stone, appeared at her door. "The king requires your presence." Her heart leaped into her throat. Led through winding, torch-lit corridors, she was brought not to a throne room or a formal hall, but to the door of the king's private chambers. The guard opened it and stepped aside, leaving her to enter alone. The room was stark and masculine, dominated by a massive hearth and a table littered with maps and daggers. Furs were thrown over heavy, dark wood furniture. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, sharp scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. King Zephyros stood by the fire, his back to her. He had shed his armor, and in a simple black tunic and trousers, he seemed both less and more intimidating. The sheer, coiled power of his physique was impossible to ignore. He turned slowly, and her breath caught. The firelight carved deep shadows onto his face, accentuating the harsh lines and the scar. In his eyes, she saw an exhaustion so profound it looked like a physical wound. A fine tremor ran through his right hand, which he quickly clenched into a fist at his side. He was fighting a battle she could not see. He did not ask her to approach. He did not ask her name. His voice, when he spoke, was rough, strained. "Dance." It was a command, not a request. Lysandra flinched. Here, in the suffocating intimacy of his private room, there was no music, no audience save for the tormented king. Fear warred with a strange flicker of empathy for the pain she saw in his eyes. She nodded mutely, her throat too tight to speak. She moved to the center of the room, the thick fur rug soft beneath her feet. Taking a shaky breath, she closed her eyes and sought that inner rhythm once more. This time, the music she found was softer, more questioning. It was a melody of uncertainty and survival. Her movements were less about defiance and more about a quiet plea for understanding. She danced the story of a caged bird, not beating its wings against the bars, but finding a small measure of freedom in its song. She did not know how long she danced. She lost herself in the motion, the only way she knew to cope with the terror and confusion that swirled within her. When she finally slowed, her limbs aching and her breath coming in soft pants, she opened her eyes. Zephyros had not moved from his spot by the fire, but the change in him was startling. The rigid tension in his shoulders had eased. The deep lines of pain around his eyes had softened. The tremor in his hand was gone. He was watching her with that same unnerving intensity, but the glacial ice in his gaze had thawed just enough for her to see the weary man beneath the monstrous king. He said nothing. He simply gave a short, sharp nod of dismissal. It became their ritual. Every night, the silent guard would come for her. Every night, she would be led to the king's chambers. Every night, he would utter that single raw command, "Dance." And she would. She danced of forgotten memories, of winter thaws, of the flight of a lone hawk against a gray sky. She danced out her fears, her loneliness, her resilient, stubborn hope. And every night, she watched as the simple act of her movement seemed to soothe the violent storm within him. He never touched her. He rarely spoke, but in the quiet moments after she finished, a strange, fragile connection grew between them in the charged silence. She was his prisoner, his tribute, but she was also, she was beginning to realize, his medicine, and she had no idea what sickness she was meant to be curing. Whispers were the currency of Zephyros's fortress, and Lysandra slowly began to accumulate a small fortune of fear and rumor. The servant girl who brought her meals, a young woman named Mira with kind but terrified eyes, was her primary source. At first, Mira would only dart in and out, her head bowed. But as the days turned into weeks, she would linger, answering Lysandra's hesitant questions in a hushed voice. "The king, he is not well," Mira had confided one morning, her hands trembling as she set down a tray of bread and cheese. "He has a temper, an affliction. Sometimes, at night, the castle shakes. We hear him roaring, not like a wolf, but like something else, something older and darker." Lysandra learned that Zephyros never took meals in the great hall. He rarely met with his own council. He had never taken a mate, nor even a consort. He was a king who ruled from the shadows of his own chambers, utterly and completely isolated. "No one touches him," Mira whispered, her eyes wide. "Ever. It is the first rule of the castle." This knowledge cast their nightly rituals in a new, more dangerous light. His torment was not just emotional, it was physical, volatile. Her dancing was not just a comfort, it was a leash on a beast she had yet to truly see. One afternoon, she was met not by Mira or a guard, but by a man whose presence was second only to the king's. He was tall and lean, with hair the color of sand and calm, intelligent eyes. He wore the black and silver of the royal guard, but with an air of command. "I am Corvus," he said, his voice even and direct, "the king's beta." He studied her not with scorn, but with a cautious, assessing gaze. "His Majesty is more settled since your arrival. The tremors are less frequent. The nights are quieter." It was the first acknowledgement from anyone that she was having an effect. Lysandra did not know what to say. "I do not know what you are," Corvus continued, his expression unreadable, "but you are playing with a fire that has consumed everyone who has ever gotten close to him. Be careful, the quiet in a storm is often the most dangerous part." His warning was not a threat, but a genuine expression of concern, which was almost more frightening. The fragile peace of their routine was shattered by the arrival of a delegation from the Obsidian Claw. Lysandra's heart seized with ice when she saw who led them. Her uncle, Alpha Theron. He strode into Zephyros's throne room, a cavernous, intimidating chamber where the throne itself was carved to look like a snarling wolf, with a practiced air of deference that failed to mask the cunning in his eyes. "King Zephyros," Theron said, bowing low, "I have come to discuss the redrawing of our shared border, and to inquire after the well-being of my delicate niece." His gaze slid to where Lysandra stood beside the throne, a position Zephyros had silently commanded her to take. It was a clear, unspoken statement of possession. "She is well." Zephyros's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Theron's eyes glinted with malice. He took a step toward Lysandra, his lips curling into a familiar, condescending smile. "Lysandra, my dear, you look pale. This harsh mountain air must be difficult for one so frail." He reached out as if to touch her arm, a gesture of familial concern that was, in truth, a blatant act of dominance. It was a reminder to her, and a challenge to Zephyros, that she was his blood, his property, a broken thing he had discarded. Before his fingers could make contact, a low growl echoed in the vast hall, a sound so primal and menacing that Theron's hand froze in midair. It came from Zephyros. He hadn't moved a muscle, yet the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. The raw, unrestrained killing intent that radiated from him was a physical force. "She is my tribute," Zephyros said, his voice lethally soft. "And you will not touch what is mine." Theron paled, snatching his hand back as if burned. He stammered an apology, his bravado crumbling in the face of the king's possessive fury. The tension in the throne room was thick enough to choke on. Lysandra stood frozen between the two alphas, one who had tormented her for years, and one whose protection was as terrifying as any threat. She had been a pawn in her uncle's game, but now she was a prize in the king's, and she could feel the board being set for a much deadlier match. Theron's presence was a poison seeping into the stones of the fortress. Though he was relegated to guest quarters far from the king's wing, his influence lingered. Zephyros was agitated, his calm shattered. The nightly ritual changed. When Lysandra was summoned to his chambers that evening, the air was thick with a volatile energy. The tremor was back in his hand, more pronounced than ever, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. "Dance!" he commanded, but his voice was a raw, guttural rasp. She obeyed, her movements more urgent, more desperate, as if she could physically weave a shield of peace around him, but it wasn't working. He paced before the fire like a caged wolf, his shadow looming large and distorted on the wall behind him. The rage and pain rolling off him were so intense, she could almost taste them. "Enough," he suddenly snarled, cutting her off mid-spin. "Leave me!" The harshness of the dismissal struck her like a slap. Heart sinking, she turned and walked toward the door, her shoulders slumped. She had failed. The fragile solace she provided had been broken. As her hand touched the cold iron latch, a sound tore through the room behind her. It was a sound of pure agony, a wet, tearing roar that was not wolf, not man, not anything she had ever heard. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to obey his command and run, but she couldn't. Corvus's warning, Mira's whispers, the torment in Zephyros's eyes, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. This was his affliction. This was the beast. She turned back. Zephyros was on his knees, his body convulsing. His back was arched in an unnatural, agonizing bow. From his skin, from the very air around him, black tendrils of pure shadow were erupting. They writhed like living things, clawing at the air, solidifying and then dissolving, hissing with a sound that scraped at her hearing. His form seemed to shimmer and distort, caught between man and something else. His eyes glowed with a feral crimson light. He lifted his head, and the face that looked at her was a nightmare mask of his own, twisted by a monstrous power. "I said, 'Leave,'" he roared, his voice a horrifying duet of his own, and a deeper, more demonic tone. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over her. But beneath it, a strange, inexplicable pull resonated within her chest, a hum that seemed to answer the violent thrumming of the shadows. She saw past the monster to the man trapped inside, the man whose pain she had been soothing for weeks. He was not a beast to be fled from. He was a soul in torment. Instead of running, she took a hesitant step forward. She began to hum, a soft, low melody, the tune she had danced to that first night, the one she held in her heart. The effect was immediate. The writhing shadows stilled for a fraction of a second. The crimson light in Zephyros's eyes flickered, a hint of his own glacial gray breaking through. He stared at her, his monstrous features contorted not just with rage, but with utter, stupefied disbelief. She was not running. She was not screaming. She was singing to his demon. In that moment of shocked lucidity, he saw her not as a tribute or a cure, but as the bravest soul he had ever encountered. The next day, a fragile calm had settled. Zephyros was himself again, though pale and drained. The confrontation came in the cold light of the throne room. Theron, emboldened by what he likely perceived as the king's instability, was making demands about trade routes, his tone bordering on insolent. And as the alpha of a sovereign pack, "I must insist," Theron was saying. "You are the alpha of a vassal pack." Zephyros cut in, his voice like ice. "And you will remember your place." He stood, descending the few steps from his throne. He stopped beside Lysandra. "My tribute seems to have forgotten her manners. Perhaps a reminder is in order." Before anyone could react, Zephyros moved. He didn't touch her. Instead, a single, deliberate tendril of shadow detached from his own and slithered through the air to gently brush against Theron's cheek. It was colder than grave dust, a touch of pure, otherworldly dread. Theron froze, his face draining of all color. He had just witnessed forbidden, monstrous magic used with casual, terrifying control. It was a silent, undeniable threat. Zephyros was not just protecting Lysandra. He was claiming her with the very power that was his curse, defying all norms of secrecy. It was a public act of defiance, choosing her over his own carefully guarded secret. Later that day, Zephyros found her in her rooms. The walls he had built around himself had been irrevocably breached. He looked at her, the woman who had seen his monster and had not fled, and he finally gave her the truth. "It is a blood curse," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of generations. "The first king of my line made a pact with a shadow entity for power, the power to build this kingdom. The price was that his wolf, and the wolf of all his descendants, would be bound to it. It is not a wolf of flesh and blood. It is a beast of rage and shadow. It grants me immense power, but it is constantly trying to consume me, to unmake me." He finally looked at her, his glacial eyes filled with a vulnerability she had never seen. "Until your dancing, your presence, it quiets the beast. It gives me clarity. I do not understand it, but it is the only peace I have ever known." The secret was out, laid bare between them. He was a monster, and she was his unlikely anchor. And in that moment of shared, terrifying truth, something new and fragile began to grow, a bond forged not of duty or tribute, but of mutual salvation. The grand feast was Theron's chosen battlefield. It was a political necessity, a formal dinner to finalize the agreements Zephyros had forced upon the obsidian claw. The great hall of the Shadow Fortress was filled with Zephyros's stern-faced council and Theron's nervous entourage. Lysandra sat at Zephyros's right hand, a position of honor that made her a target for Theron's simmering rage. He watched her from across the high table, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He believed he had found the king's weakness. Theron proposed a toast. "To our new alliance, and to the king's health," he boomed, gesturing for a servant to fill Zephyros's goblet from a special cask of wine he had brought as a gift. It was a dark, rich vintage, smelling of blackberries and deceit. Corvus moved to intercept, his hand on his dagger, but Zephyros waved him off. To refuse the toast would be a diplomatic insult, a sign of weakness. He knew it was a trap. He could see the triumph in Theron's eyes, but he would not cower. He lifted the silver goblet, his gaze meeting Lysandra's for a brief, reassuring moment, and then he drank. The effect was not immediate, but it was catastrophic. The wine was laced with more than just poison. It was an alchemical nightmare, a blend of concentrated wolfsbane and shadowthorn, an herb known in dark legends to drive shadow creatures into a blood frenzy. It was designed not to kill him, but to utterly shatter his control. A low groan escaped Zephyros's lips. He dropped the goblet, which clattered to the stone floor. He gripped the arms of his throne, his knuckles turning white. The curse, which he had fought to a tense stalemate for years, hit him like a tidal wave. Black veins pulsed on his neck and temples. The shadow tendrils erupted from his back, no longer controlled wisps, but thick, violent lashes of living darkness that smashed plates and sent goblets flying. Panic exploded in the hall. Chairs scraped back as lords and ladies scrambled away in terror. Guards drew their swords, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Theron remained seated, a smug, victorious look on his face. "The king is unwell," he shouted over the din. "He is a monster, a danger to us all. Seize him!" Zephyros threw his head back and roared, the sound a horrific blend of his own voice and the demonic screech of the shadow beast. His form began to shift and swell, his hands elongating into wicked claws. his teeth sharpening into fangs. The crimson glow of the beast's rage burned in his eyes, consuming the last vestiges of his control. He was losing. The beast was winning. Through the red haze of pain and fury, he saw two things. Theron, smirking, already moving to position himself as the savior of the panicked court, and Lysandra. She hadn't run. She stood beside the throne, her face pale with fear but her eyes wide with a fierce, unwavering resolve. The beast wanted to destroy. It wanted to tear Theron limb from limb. It wanted to plunge the entire hall into a nightmare of shadow and blood. It saw Lysandra as a fragile thing in its path, a part of Zephyros. The man, the king, screamed at her from within the prison of his own flesh. Run! This was the ultimate choice. He could retreat, flee to his chambers and fight his battle in private, leaving his court and Lysandra to Theron's mercy. Or he could stand and fight, here, now, and risk exposing the full horror of his curse to the world, proving Theron right. He chose her. With a titanic effort of will, he forced the raging beast to focus. He would not let it harm her. He would protect her, even if it was the last act of his sanity. He took a staggering step toward Theron, putting his monstrous, shifting body between the traitor and Lysandra. But Lysandra had no intention of being protected. She saw his choice, saw the agonizing battle in his eyes. He was fighting for her, and she would fight for him. She stepped out from behind the throne into the wide, cleared space in the center of the hall. The chaos swirled around her, a vortex of screams and drawn steel. She ignored it all. Her world narrowed to the magnificent, terrifying creature that was her king. There was no music. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howls of the beast, and the panicked shouts of the court. In the heart of that terrifying symphony, Lysandra began to dance. Her feet found their rhythm on the cold stone. It was not a dance of sorrow or defiance. It was a dance of absolute, radical acceptance. Her arms swept up, not in fear, but in welcome. Her body spun, not in a desperate flight, but in a confident orbit around the storm that was Zephyros. It was a dance that said, I see all of you, the man, the king, and the monster, and I am not afraid. The effect was more powerful than any spell. The violent, lashing shadows, drawn to her movement, seemed to lose their vicious edge. They slowed, their hissing quieted. Instead of trying to tear the world apart, they began to weave around her, drawn to her grace as moths to a flame. The crimson inferno in Zephyros's eyes flickered. He saw her, a beacon of impossible calm in his personal hell. Her trust was a shield. Her acceptance was an anchor. She danced closer, her movements fluid and fearless. The shadow tendrils, now moving with a strange, hypnotic grace of their own, wrapped gently around her wrists and waist, not to restrain, but to connect. The power of the curse, amplified by the poison, was still there. But it was no longer a mindless rage. It was listening to her. Zephyros felt the change down to his bones. Her courage was flowing into him, giving him strength. He found a focal point in her eyes, a place to anchor his will. With a final shuddering roar that was more controlled, more his, he forced the transformation back. The claws receded. The shadows drew back into his skin. The monstrous features smoothed back into his own harsh, beloved face. He stood panting, sweat beading on his brow, exhausted but whole. He was still the Shadow King, power thrumming beneath his skin, but he was in command. She had not banished his demon. She had taught it how to dance. A profound, ringing silence descended upon the great hall. The court, which had been cowering moments before, now stared in absolute awe. They had witnessed their king transform into a thing of nightmare, and then they had witnessed a small, wolfless omega tame that nightmare, with nothing but movement and courage. Zephyros's breathing was harsh, but his eyes were clear. He straightened to his full, imposing height. The residual power of the shadow beast, clinging to him like a royal mantle. He turned his gaze from Lysandra, a look of infinite gratitude passing between them, and fixed it upon his true enemy. Theron was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. His plan had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. He had meant to expose a monster, and had instead revealed a savior. Slowly, Zephyros raised a hand, his fingers still tinged with shadow. He pointed directly at the trembling Alpha. "Traitor," he said. The word was not shouted. It was a low, cold pronouncement of doom that carried more weight than any roar. That single word broke the spell of shock. Corvus was the first to move. With a sharp cry of, "For the king!" he and the royal guard surged forward. Theron's few loyalists made a pathetic attempt to defend him, but they were quickly and efficiently subdued. Corvus himself slammed Theron against the high table, twisting his arms behind his back. "The wine cask," Zephyros commanded, his voice regaining its full authority. A guard brought the cask forward, and a royal taster, his hands shaking, analyzed a sample. "Shadowthorn and wolfsbane, my lord," he confirmed, his voice trembling. "A potent, forbidden concoction. Enough to drive any wolf mad with rage." The evidence was irrefutable. Theron's plot was laid bare for all to see. He spat and struggled in Corvus's grip. "She's a witch," he shrieked, his eyes wild with desperation. "She has enchanted him. That thing should have torn you all apart." Zephyros walked calmly toward him, the crowd parting before him like the sea. He stopped before his defeated foe. "She is not a witch," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is my queen." He looked back at Lysandra, his expression softening into something no one in his court had ever seen on his face before. Pure, unadulterated love. He turned his attention back to Theron. "You sought to use my curse against me. You will now experience a curse of your own." He placed a hand on Theron's forehead. A pulse of black energy flowed from him, and Theron screamed. "You value the strength of the wolf above all else, so you will live without it." Zephyros stripped Theron of his alpha status, severed his connection to his wolf, and banished him, casting him out to live as a wolfless rogue, the very fate he had so despised in others. With the threat neutralized and the traitor dragged away, Zephyros turned his full attention to Lysandra. The court watched, holding its collective breath. This was a moment that would redefine their kingdom. He walked to her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He did not stop before her. He knelt. The Alpha King, the conqueror of the Shadowlands, the man who bent to no one, knelt on the cold stone floor before the Omega he had taken as tribute. A collective gasp swept the hall. "Lysandra," he said, his voice raw with emotion as he took her hand. "You called me a monster. You were wrong. I was just a man lost in a storm. You are not my medicine. You are my anchor. You are the eye of the hurricane. You are my salvation." He looked up at her, his glacial eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You are my mate." He rose, and before the stunned eyes of his entire court, he lowered his head and gently, reverently, bit the juncture of her neck and shoulder. It was not the savage, claiming bite of a possessive alpha, but a tender, sacred act. A mark bloomed on her skin, a swirl of shadow and light, a perfect, intricate pattern that seemed to hum with a quiet power. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. A new strength flowed into Lysandra, the power of a Luna, the might of the Shadowlands, all of it tempered by her own unique grace. She was no longer the shattered Omega. She was the Shadow Queen, a lone lord, then another, and then the entire court dropped to one knee. They were not bowing to the wolfless girl from a disgraced pack. They were bowing to the woman who had brought light to their shadows, the Luna who had calmed their king's demon and, in doing so, had saved them all. Their kingdom would no longer be defined only by strength and fear. It would now be defined by a new, more profound power, the power of grace. 1 year later, the fortress of the Shadowlands was transformed. Where once there had been only bare stone and grim tapestries, now ivy climbed the walls of the inner courtyards, and vibrant flowers bloomed in stone planters that Lysandra had insisted upon. Laughter, a sound once foreign to these halls, could now be heard echoing from time to time. The kingdom was not softer, but it was stronger, its foundations reinforced by a newfound balance. Zephyros was a changed man. The curse was not gone, but it was no longer a curse. It was simply his power, a part of him that he now controlled with perfect clarity, an extension of his will that was tempered by his mate's influence. The shadows still clung to him, but they were calm, and the permanent exhaustion had finally lifted from his eyes. He smiled now, a true, breathtaking smile that was reserved almost exclusively for his Luna. He found her in the new garden she had cultivated on the highest terrace, a riot of moonlight blossoms that only opened after dusk. She stood watching the stars, a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his hands gently on the swell of her belly. "He is restless tonight," Zephyros murmured, his lips brushing her temple. He could feel the faint, fluttering kicks of their unborn son against his palm. Lysandra leaned back against his solid warmth, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "He is your son." "He is merely practicing his battle cries." Zephyros chuckled, the sound a low, happy rumble in his chest. A miracle. The healers had all called her barren, a vessel sealed by fate. But fate, it seemed, had little power against a love forged in shadow and light. Their child, the heir to the Shadowlands, would be born of both a prince with his father's strength and his mother's grace. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his scarred, beloved face. "They called me useless," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "They said my dancing served no purpose." Zephyros caught a tear with his thumb. "Your dance did not just serve a purpose, my love," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It redrew the stars. It saved a kingdom. It saved me." He bent his head and kissed her. A long, slow kiss under the silent watch of the moon. A king and queen who had found their perfect, impossible rhythm in a world that had only ever known discord.